Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. The night was like any other, cool and quiet as I made my way home. I preferred walking. It cleared my mind after long days. My route took me past an unfinished construction site, a skeletal structure shrouded in metal beams and scaffolding. Usually the site was dark and lifeless at night, a yawning reminder of projects left half done. But that evening, something was different. From a distance, I noticed lights flickering at the site. They weren't steady like work lights. Instead, they pulsated erratically, as though someone were moving through the area with a flashlight. I slowed my pace, glancing around. The street was empty, and the surrounding buildings loomed like silent sentinels. For a moment, I considered ignoring it and continuing home. It wasn't my business, after all. But something gnawed at me, a mixture of curiosity and unease. Why would anyone be working at this hour, and why with such a chaotic light? My steps faltered, and before I could overthink it, I veered off the sidewalk and approached the chain-link fence encircling the site. The gate was slightly ajar. I pushed the gate open, its hinges creaking loudly against the stillness. The air inside felt colder, and the faint smell of damp earth and rust greeted me. The flickering light danced erratically, casting strange shadows against the skeletal framework of the building. My footsteps crunched softly over gravel as I ventured deeper. The place was a mess. Tools were scattered across the ground. Hammers, wrenches, and pieces of piping lay abandoned like discarded toys. A stack of metal beams had toppled over, their harsh lines crossing like tangled skeletons. I saw shattered glass near what looked like a temporary workstation, its desk overturned and papers strewn everywhere. The disorder didn't feel accidental. I crouched to inspect a set of deep scratches gouged into the concrete floor. They weren't made by any tool I could think of. Nearby, a long, dark streak led from the center of the chaos toward the far end of the site, disappearing into a patch of overgrown vegetation that bordered the property. The tracks were oddly clear, as though something or someone had been dragged through the dirt. A lump formed in my throat, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a stray animal or some bored kids messing around. Yet, even as I tried to rationalize it, I found myself stepping toward the thicket. The trees and bushes beyond the site were denser than they had seemed from a distance, their branches clawing at me as I pushed through. The air grew heavier, muffling the distant hum of traffic and leaving only the sound of my own breathing. The flashlight on my phone provided a weak glow, barely enough to cut through the oppressive darkness. The tracks were still visible, carved into the soft earth like an unspoken invitation. I followed them, my heartbeat quickening with each step. The deeper I went, the more unnatural the surroundings felt, as though I'd crossed an invisible threshold into some place I wasn't meant to be. Then I saw it. A figure crouched a few meters ahead, half obscured by the underbrush. They were hunched over something large, their movements deliberate and unhurried. The object in question, a lumpy bag, was being tied shut with thick rope. The way the figure worked was methodical, almost ritualistic, and I felt my stomach churn. I froze, unsure whether to approach or retreat. My light must have caught their attention because they stopped abruptly, their heads snapping in my direction. For a moment, we both stayed still, locked in an uncomfortable silence. My light fell on their face, or at least what I thought was their face. Their features were hard to make out, shadowed and distorted, but something about them seemed wrong, almost unnatural. They straightened slowly, still holding the rope. Then, in a voice that chilled me to the core, they said something. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was guttural, strange, as if the sounds didn't belong to a human throat. Panic surged through me as they took a step forward. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The figure dropped the bag and broke into a sprint, barreling toward me with startling speed. That snapped me out of my paralysis. I turned and bolted back through the thicket, branches tearing at my arms and face. I barely held onto my phone, its flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. Behind me, I could hear their heavy footsteps, each one growing louder, closer. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would give out, but the primal need to survive kept me moving. The edge of the construction site came into view, its chaotic mess offering some hope of escape. I darted through the debris, tripping once but scrambling back to my feet. When I glanced back, the figure had stopped at the thicket's edge, silhouetted against the dim glow of my phone's light. Then, without another sound, they turned and melted back into the darkness. The moment I lost sight of the figure, I felt a wave of relief, but it was fleeting. My body ached from the sprint, my lungs heaving as I stumbled away from the construction site. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified. My phone's flashlight was still on, casting uneven light on the gravel and weeds beneath my feet, but the glow felt useless against the suffocating dark around me. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, the hum of distant cars finally reaching my ears. I glanced back once more, expecting to see the figure emerging from the thicket, but the site loomed empty and still. Even the erratic lights I'd seen earlier were gone. It was as if the place had swallowed itself, retreating into its unfinished silence. The walk home felt endless. My pace quickened at every imagined sound, every faint shuffle of leaves. By the time I reached my apartment, my legs were trembling and my throat felt raw. I locked the door behind me, sliding the deadbolt into place with shaky hands. For the first time, I noticed the deep scratches on my forearms and the smears of dirt on my clothes. The night's events felt unreal, like a fever dream I couldn't shake. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew the figure had seen me. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through the possibilities. Who or what had I encountered? And what was in that bag? The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it as some deranged person disposing of evidence, but the strange way they had moved, the sound of their voice, defied explanation. The next day, I avoided the construction site altogether. My usual route felt tainted, as though returning would invite whatever I had seen back into my life. Instead, I took the long way around, weaving through busy streets where the noise of the city drowned out my thoughts. But the memory stayed with me. Over the following nights, I found myself checking the locks on my doors and windows obsessively. Any unusual sound, a creak, a distant knock, sent a jolt of fear through me. I even considered calling the police, but what would I say? That I'd seen someone tying up a bag in the woods and they'd chased me? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. Still, the feeling that I was being watched grew stronger. I started noticing subtle things, the faint smell of damp earth near my window, the sense of movement in my peripheral vision. It was as though the figure had followed me home, their presence lingering just out of sight. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Something was wrong. A few nights after the incident, I woke to the sound of faint tapping on my bedroom window. My apartment was on the second floor, and there was no logical way someone could be outside. Still, I stayed frozen in bed, my heart pounding as I listened. The tapping stopped after a few seconds, but I didn't move until the first light of dawn crept into the room. When I finally worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been outside. But the unease didn't fade. The sensation of being watched became constant, a weight pressing down on me no matter where I went. Even in crowded places, I felt alone, vulnerable, as though the figure's presence had seeped into my life permanently. I began to avoid walking at night altogether, sticking to well-lit, crowded areas whenever possible. But even during the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that seemed too deliberate, too human. Each time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Finally, I decided to confront the fear head-on. I returned to the construction site during the day, hoping to find some clue that would make sense of what had happened. To my surprise, the site was entirely cleared out. The equipment and debris were gone, leaving only a barren dirt lot behind. Even the thicket looked less dense, its branches trimmed back as though someone had tried to erase its ominous presence. The highway stretched endlessly before me, a dark ribbon cutting through the emptiness. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the road lulling me into a state of exhaustion. The glowing numbers on my dashboard told me it was well past midnight. When I saw the dim neon sign for a roadside hotel flickering in the distance, I decided to pull over. Sleep was no longer a suggestion, it was a necessity. The parking lot was sparse, illuminated by a few flickering overhead lights. Most of the spaces were empty, save for a few scattered vehicles, their silhouettes huddled together like forgotten relics. As I pulled into a spot near the entrance, I noticed a man standing near the edge of the lot. His figure was partially obscured by shadows, but his gaze was unmistakably fixed on me. At first, I thought he might be a security guard, but there was something unnerving about his posture. He didn't move, didn't wave, just watched. I stepped out of the car and his eyes followed me. "Excuse me," I called out. "Is this where I check in?" He didn't respond. His head tilted slightly as if considering my question, but his silence was unsettling. Finally, he gave a small nod and turned, walking slowly toward the building's side entrance. Unease prickled at my skin, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just shy or didn't speak much English. Either way, I needed a bed, not a conversation. The lobby was dimly lit, the air heavy with a faint, musty smell. It wasn't dirty, but it wasn't welcoming either. A small desk stood at the far end of the room, its surface cluttered with a few outdated brochures and a bell that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Behind the desk was a receptionist, a middle-aged man with a pale complexion and sharp, serious features. His expression was neutral, almost mechanical, as he acknowledged my presence with a curt nod. "I need a room," I said, approaching the desk. My voice sounded louder than I intended in the oppressive quiet. He pulled a ledger from beneath the counter, his movements deliberate and slow. "How many nights?" he asked, his tone flat, devoid of any warmth. "Just one," I replied. As he filled out the paperwork, I mentioned the man in the parking lot. "Is he a security guard or something?" He seemed a bit odd. The receptionist didn't look up. "Probably one of the maintenance staff?" He said dismissively, sliding the room key across the desk. "Room 107. Checkout's at 11. I hesitated, waiting for some hint of reassurance or even small talk, but he simply stared, his expression unreadable. Gripping the key, I muttered a quick thanks and made my way to the room. Room 107 was located at the end of a narrow corridor. The carpet was threadbare in places, and the walls bore faint stains that time and cleaning attempts had failed to erase. My room wasn't much better. The bedspread was clean enough, but the air felt stale, as if the room hadn't been aired out in weeks. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion settling in. But just as I began to relax, a noise broke the silence, a sharp, high-pitched sound coming from the room next door. It started faintly, almost like the whining of an old television, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. The sound wasn't rhythmic or consistent. It fluctuated erratically, like nails being dragged across a chalkboard. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just some outdated appliance or faulty plumbing. But after several minutes, it became unbearable. I knocked on the wall, hoping the occupant would hear me and lower the volume. The sound stopped momentarily, but no voice responded. I decided to confront it directly. Grabbing my room key, I stepped into the hallway and approached the door to room 108. I knocked firmly. "Hello? Could you keep it down, please?" No response. The sound stopped again, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. I waited, my ear to the door, but all I could hear was my own breathing. Frustrated, I returned to the reception desk. The same receptionist was there, his expression unchanged, as though he hadn't moved an inch since I'd last seen him. "Excuse me," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a loud noise coming from the room next to mine." I knocked, but no one answered. "Could you check it out?" The man's eyes flicked up to meet mine, but there was no recognition, no empathy. "Old plumbing," he said simply, his voice as flat as before. "It didn't sound like plumbing," I replied, my frustration slipping through. "And why wouldn't the person in the room answer?" The receptionist's gaze didn't waver. "Room 108 is unoccupied," he said matter-of-factly. His answer stunned me. "That's impossible," I said. "I heard noises, loud ones. Someone's in there." He shrugged, as if to say the matter wasn't worth discussing further. "If you'd like, I can call maintenance in the morning." I stared at him, my unease deepening. His tone, his body language, it was as if he wasn't acknowledging my concerns at all, just brushing them off like a routine annoyance. Realizing I wasn't going to get any answers, I nodded tersely and returned to my room. Back in my room, I couldn't shake the unsettling exchange at the reception desk. The receptionist's demeanor, the man in the parking lot, the unanswered knocks, all of it felt off, as though the hotel itself was wrapped in some unseen tension. I locked the door behind me, sliding the deadbolt into place and double-checking the latch. The high-pitched sound didn't return, but a different noise emerged. This time, it was rhythmic, soft tapping, faint but deliberate, coming from the wall between my room and 108. The same wall I'd knocked on earlier. My pulse quickened as I pressed my ear to the surface, straining to decipher the source. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. I stepped back, unnerved. If room 108 was unoccupied, as the receptionist claimed, then what was causing the noise? My imagination spiraled, conjuring images of someone or something lurking just out of sight. Desperate for clarity, I peeked out the window. The parking lot was quiet, save for the faint hum of the highway beyond. But near the edge of the building, partially hidden by shadows, stood the same man I'd seen earlier. He was watching again, his figure unnervingly still. When I turned my head to look directly at him, he took a single step backward, further into the shadows, and disappeared. Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every faint noise in the room made my heart race. I felt trapped, the walls closing in with a suffocating weight. My focus kept drifting back to room 108. If the room was empty, then why had I heard sounds coming from it? And if it wasn't empty, why had the receptionist lied? Unable to bear the suspense, I made a decision. I needed to check the room myself. Grabbing my key and phone, I stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound. Room 108 loomed ahead of me, its door plain and unassuming. I knocked again, this time louder. The sound echoed down the corridor, but the door remained closed. I reached out hesitantly, turning the knob. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. The door creaked open slightly, revealing a dark interior. I hesitated on the threshold, peering inside. The room was in disarray. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and hanging off the mattress. Furniture was overturned, a chair lying on its side and the small desk pushed against the far wall. The air was heavy with a faint sour smell, like mildew and something faintly metallic. As I stepped back, my flashlight caught a flicker of movement in the corner, a shadow shifting unnaturally fast. Panic gripped me, and I slammed the door shut, stumbling backward into the hallway. I didn't wait to see if anything followed me. Heart pounding, I rushed back to the reception desk. The receptionist was still there, his posture unchanged. It was as though he hadn't moved since I'd left earlier. I could barely form coherent words. "I checked room 108, I blurted out. "You said it was empty, but it's not. The room is a mess, and I swear I saw." He cut me off with a raised hand, his expression cold and detached. "Room 108 is unoccupied," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But I saw," I started, my voice rising. "Perhaps you're overtired," he interrupted, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "It's been a long drive. These things happen." His refusal to acknowledge my concerns only deepened my unease. I glanced around the lobby, hoping for another staff member or guest to back me up, but the place was empty. Even the brochures on the desk looked untouched, as though they'd been sitting there for years. The receptionist's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "You're welcome to leave if you're uncomfortable." That was all I needed to hear. I returned to my room in a daze, grabbed my bag, and threw my belongings together without care. Every instinct screamed at me to leave as quickly as possible. As I walked back to my car, the man from the parking lot stood by the edge of the building once again. His posture was rigid, his gaze unwavering. This time, I didn't bother trying to approach or speak to him. I slid into my car, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. Starting the engine, I glanced into the rearview mirror. The receptionist had joined the man in the parking lot. Both of them stood motionless, their eyes fixed on me as I pulled out of the lot and onto the highway. The night air was cool and still as I stood at the bus stop, my jacket pulled tight against the faint breeze. It was late, much later than I usually stayed out, and the street was unusually quiet. Only the occasional distant sound of a car engine reminded me I wasn't entirely alone in the world. The bench at the stop was empty, save for an old advertisement for some long-forgotten event peeling off its surface. I sat down, pulling out my phone to pass the time. The bus schedule was inconsistent at this hour, and I had already resigned myself to the possibility of waiting a while. As I scrolled aimlessly, a faint crunch of footsteps reached my ears. I glanced up instinctively. A man was approaching from down the street. His steps were hurried but uneven, like someone unsure whether they wanted to continue forward or turn back. He wore a dark jacket, its collar pulled up high, and a cap that obscured most of his face. I returned my gaze to my phone, trying not to appear overly interested, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. The man reached the stop and, without a word, sat down on the opposite end of the bench. I glanced sideways at him. He didn't make eye contact, instead staring out into the empty street. The man's presence became increasingly hard to ignore. He was fidgety, his fingers tapping against the edge of the bench. His head turned every few seconds, scanning the street behind us as though expecting someone or something to appear at any moment. When his gaze wasn't darting around, it was fixed on the watch on his wrist. The constant repetition made it impossible to focus on my phone. I decided to break the tension. "Long wait, huh?" I said, offering a casual smile. His head turned toward me, but his eyes didn't meet mine. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice low and strained. Then, just as quickly, he turned back to scanning the street. "Do you know if the bus is still running this late?" I asked, trying again to engage him. He didn't answer at first, his fingers drumming faster against the bench. "Not sure," he said finally, his tone dismissive. There was something about the way he spoke, hurried, detached, that made my stomach tighten. I decided to leave him alone, but my curiosity grew. He wasn't just nervous, he was downright anxious. His hands trembled slightly, and his foot tapped erratically on the ground. Whatever he was waiting for, he didn't seem happy about it. A few minutes passed in tense silence. I checked the time on my phone and sighed, wondering if I should just start walking home. As I debated, the faint sound of an engine reached my ears. It grew louder, and soon, headlights appeared from around the corner, illuminating the otherwise dark street. A black sedan rolled up to the curb, its windows tinted and exterior gleaming under the streetlight. My unease deepened as the car stopped directly in front of the bus stop. For a moment, nothing happened. The car idled, its engine purring softly, and I could feel the tension radiating from the stranger beside me. The doors opened abruptly. Two men stepped out, moving with purpose. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces grim and focused. The stranger beside me stiffened, his breath hitching audibly. Without warning, the two men started toward him. "Hey!" one of them shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. The stranger bolted. He shot up from the bench and sprinted into the shadows without so much as a glance in my direction. The men pursued him immediately, their heavy footsteps echoing against the pavement. I sat frozen, unsure of what to do, when the third car door opened. Another man stepped out of the car. He was taller than the others, his shoulders broad and his movements deliberate. For a moment, I thought he might follow the others in chasing the stranger, but then his head turned toward me. "You!" he barked, pointing in my direction. "You're with him, aren't you?" My blood ran cold. "What?" I stammered, taking an instinctive step back. I wasn't with anyone. I didn't even know the stranger's name. But the man didn't care. He started toward me, his pace quick and aggressive. "You thought you'd help him get away?" he shouted, his tone accusing. "You're an accomplice!" I didn't wait to explain myself. Fear gripped me, and I turned and ran. The quiet street, once a source of calm, now felt like a maze with no exit. My feet pounded against the pavement as I glanced back to see him gaining on me. His strides were longer, his pace unrelenting. Just as panic threatened to consume me, I spotted headlights up ahead. A taxi was approaching, its bright yellow frame a beacon of hope. I waved frantically, running into the middle of the street to force it to stop. The driver honked in protest but slowed as I reached the door and flung it open. "Drive! Please! Just drive!" I shouted, slamming the door shut behind me. The driver hesitated, glancing at the man still running toward us. "Go now!" I pleaded, my voice cracking. The taxi lurched forward, its tires screeching as it sped down the street. I turned to look back through the rear window. The man stood in the middle of the road, watching as the taxi disappeared into the night. The taxi raced down the dimly lit street, the sound of its engine drowning out the pounding of my heart. I slumped back in the seat, my breathing ragged as adrenaline coursed through me. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his expression a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "What was that about?" he asked, his tone sharp but not unkind. I shook my head, unable to form a coherent response. My mind was still reeling. I wasn't sure what had just happened or why I had been dragged into it. All I knew was that I needed to get as far away as possible from that bus stop and the men in the sedan. As the car sped along the empty road, I turned to look out the back window. The streetlights flickered over the asphalt, but there was no sign of the black sedan or the man who had chased me. Relief trickled in slowly, though it did little to calm my nerves. "Where are you headed?" the driver asked again, his eyes meeting mine briefly in the mirror. "Just downtown," I stammered. It was the first place that came to mind, somewhere I hoped would be busy and safe. The driver nodded and fell silent. The hum of the engine filled the cab, a monotonous noise that helped anchor me in reality. I stared out the window, the city lights drawing closer, though the sense of dread lingered like a shadow over my thoughts. As we entered the city, the streets became busier, the bright neon signs of late-night diners and bars lighting up the sidewalks. The presence of people should have reassured me, but instead I found myself hyper-aware of every shadow and movement. The memory of the man chasing me, his accusations ringing in my ears, refused to fade. "Hey," the driver said suddenly, breaking the silence. "That guy back there? Was he after you?" Looked serious. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "He thought I was with someone else, a guy at the bus stop. They ran after him, but then he came after me instead." The driver whistled softly, shaking his head. "Sounds like you got caught in the middle of something you didn't sign up for. Lucky I came by when I did." Lucky. The word echoed uncomfortably in my mind. I didn't feel lucky. I felt hunted, like prey that had narrowly escaped a predator's jaws. I leaned back in the seat, trying to steady my breathing. My fingers gripped the edge of the seat, knuckles white. As the taxi turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of another black car in the distance. For a fleeting moment, panic surged through me, but as we moved closer, I realized it was just a regular sedan, parked harmlessly outside a diner. My paranoia was beginning to spiral. "You sure you're okay?" the driver asked, his tone softer now. "Yeah," I lied. "Just a rough night." The cab dropped me off near a well-lit corner in the heart of the city. As I stepped out, I thanked the driver and paid the fare with shaking hands. He gave me a curt nod before driving off, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk. The city felt alive, bustling even at this late hour. People moved in clusters, laughter and conversation spilling out of nearby bars. Yet, amidst the crowd, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every glance over my shoulder revealed nothing, but the sensation persisted, burrowing into my mind like a splinter. I decided to keep moving. Staying in one place felt dangerous, like inviting trouble. My footsteps echoed faintly against the concrete as I wandered the busy streets, weaving between groups of people and trying to blend in. Despite the safety of the crowd, my thoughts returned to the bus stop. Who was that stranger? What had he done to make those men chase him so relentlessly? And why had they turned on me? The questions piled up with no answers in sight, leaving only a gnawing sense of unease. The nights in my neighborhood were always peaceful, a blanket of quiet, interrupted only by the occasional distant bark of a dog or the low hum of a passing car. It was the kind of calm that I had grown used to, even found comfort in. My evening routine often included a short walk near the edge of the woods that bordered our street. I liked the fresh air, the solitude, and the way the world seemed to pause under the stars. It was on one of these walks, late into the night, that I first noticed the lights. At first, they were faint, quick flashes that I might have mistaken for fireflies, if not for their brightness and consistency. They came from deep within the woods, too far to be a neighbor's porch light, and too erratic to be headlights reflecting through the trees. I stopped in my tracks, squinting into the darkness. The flashes continued, moving slightly, as if someone were signaling or searching for something. My first thought was that someone might need help. I cupped my hands around my mouth and called out, "Hello? Is anyone out there?" The flashes stopped immediately, plunging the woods into darkness. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I waited, listening for a response. Footsteps, a voice, anything, but nothing came. After a moment, I turned and headed home, the uneasy feeling clinging to me like a shadow. The next morning, I couldn't shake the memory of the lights. Over breakfast, I found myself staring out the window toward the woods, replaying the moment in my mind. Who had been out there, and why had they stopped as soon as I called out? I considered mentioning it to a neighbor, but stopped myself. What could I even say? That I'd seen some lights in the woods at night? It sounded trivial, even to me. Instead, I tried to push the incident out of my mind, telling myself it was probably just a couple of kids playing with flashlights. But as the days passed, I found myself glancing toward the woods more often. I'd linger by the edge during my walks, half expecting to see the flashes again. At night, I'd leave my curtains open, my eyes drifting toward the dark tree line as I lay in bed. The lights didn't return, but the memory of them refused to fade. It wasn't fear that kept me fixated, it was curiosity. I wanted to know who or what had been out there, why they had stopped when I called out, and why the woods now seemed quieter than usual, as if holding on to a secret. It was nearly a week later, on another late-night walk, when I saw them again. This time, the flashes were brighter, sharper, and more erratic, cutting through the darkness like small bursts of lightning. They came from the same area as before, deep in the woods. I stopped on the sidewalk, my heart racing, not from fear, but from anticipation. I didn't call out this time. Instead, I watched, straining to make sense of the lights. They moved slowly at first, then quickly, as though someone with a flashlight was searching for something in the underbrush. I stood there for several minutes, watching the lights bob and weave through the trees. The movements seemed purposeful, but something about them felt off. It wasn't just the directionless way they moved, it was the pauses, the moments when the lights would stop abruptly, only to resume as if responding to an unseen cue. This time, I didn't turn away. I resolved to get closer, to see what or who was out there. I told myself it was probably harmless, just someone exploring the woods or playing a prank. But deep down, I felt the first flickers of unease. The woods loomed before me, dark and uninviting. I hesitated at the edge, my feet crunching softly on the gravel path that led into the trees. The flashes were still visible, now faint and distant, but enough to guide me. I stepped off the path, my breathing shallow as I moved quietly through the underbrush. The air in the woods felt different, thicker, heavier. The usual rustling of leaves and chirping of crickets was absent, replaced by a tense, oppressive silence. Every step I took seemed impossibly loud, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot betraying my approach. I was close now. The flashes grew brighter as I neared, illuminating the surrounding trees in brief, eerie bursts. My pulse quickened as I reached a small clearing. I crouched low, peering through the shadows. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the clearing, holding a flashlight. The light flickered as they moved, their body partially obscured by the trees. They appeared to be looking for something, their movements deliberate yet frantic. I inched closer, careful to stay hidden. Just as I was about to call out, the figure froze. They must have heard me, or perhaps sensed my presence. Without warning, they turned off the flashlight, plunging the clearing into darkness. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it. Quick, heavy footsteps retreating deeper into the woods. The figure was running. The sound of the figure's footsteps echoed in the stillness, growing fainter as they disappeared deeper into the woods. I stayed rooted to the spot, my body frozen with a mixture of fear and curiosity. My eyes strained to adjust to the darkness left in the absence of the flashlight's beam. The clearing felt unnervingly quiet, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. For a fleeting moment, I considered chasing after them. The desire to know who they were and what they were doing burned inside me, but a deeper instinct kept me from moving. Whoever they were, they clearly didn't want to be seen, and the way they fled without hesitation sent a clear message. I wasn't welcome here. I decided to retreat. Slowly and carefully, I backed away from the clearing, trying to make as little noise as possible. The woods felt more oppressive now, the darkness pressing in on me. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me flinch, my heart pounding as though expecting the figure to return at any moment. When I finally reached the edge of the woods and stepped back onto the gravel path, I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The streetlights beyond the tree line seemed impossibly bright and comforting. I glanced back once more, half expecting to see the flashlight's beam return, but the woods remained dark and silent. The next morning, the encounter felt like a half-remembered dream, but the unease lingered. Over coffee, I replayed the events in my mind, trying to piece together what had happened. Who was that person? What were they doing in the woods at night? And why had they run the moment they noticed me? I decided to ask around. My neighbors were mostly older folks who'd lived in the area for years and knew the woods better than anyone. During casual conversations, I brought up the lights, framing it as harmless curiosity. Probably just kids messing around, one neighbor suggested, though their tone was dismissive, as if the idea didn't warrant further thought. Another neighbor offered a different explanation. Hunters. Illegal, maybe, they said, nodding gravely. Some people think those woods are fair game after dark, though they're not supposed to be out there. The theories didn't satisfy me. The figure's behavior didn't align with a prankster or a hunter. They'd seemed too purposeful, too deliberate. I searched local news reports for any mention of strange activity in the area, but found nothing. The lack of answers only deepened my frustration and unease. I began taking my walks near the woods more often, hoping the lights would return. Each night, I stood at the edge of the trees, scanning the darkness, waiting for the faint flicker of movement. But the woods remained still, their silence almost mocking. Weeks passed, and the lights never reappeared. The woods, once a source of intrigue and curiosity, now felt foreboding. During the day they were just trees and shadows, but at night they seemed to take on a different presence, darker, heavier, as though hiding something just out of reach. I stopped walking near the woods altogether. The air around them felt different now, colder, and every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves made my chest tighten. The memory of the figure with the flashlight haunted me, a shadow in the back of my mind. Even though the lights were gone, their absence felt as unsettling as their presence had been. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, if my mind had twisted a harmless moment into something sinister. But the sound of the footsteps, the flashlight's sudden darkness, and the figure's hasty retreat were too vivid to dismiss. Despite the silence, I couldn't let go of the feeling that the woods were watching, waiting. The fear wasn't of the lights themselves, but of what or who had caused them to vanish. I had almost given up on finding the perfect house. After months of searching, every property I toured seemed to miss the mark. Too small, too noisy, too far from my vision of home. That's why the call from the realtor caught me off guard. Her voice was upbeat, almost overly eager, as she described a house that sounded too good to be true. "It's everything you've been looking for," she said, rattling off the features. Spacious rooms, modern updates, a large backyard, and nestled in a quiet, picturesque area. "You're the first person I thought of. It's a private showing, so no competition." The offer was hard to resist. She texted me the address, and as I looked it up, the photos added to the allure. The house was beautiful, with a classic charm and just enough personality to feel unique. The only oddity was its location, farther out than I'd planned, down a narrow road with no visible neighbors. When I arrived at the property, the house stood bathed in golden evening light, its exterior even more appealing than in the photos. But as I parked, the stillness around it gave me pause. There were no birds chirping, no rustle of leaves, just an eerie, empty silence. The realtor stepped out onto the front porch, waving enthusiastically. "Welcome," she called out, her smile warm but somehow unsettling. "Let's get started." The house was undeniably gorgeous. The moment I stepped inside, I was struck by how perfectly it aligned with my vision of a dream home. The hardwood floors gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting, and the open layout made the space feel both expansive and inviting. "This is the living room," the realtor said, gesturing with an almost theatrical flourish. "Feel free to look around at your own pace. I'll be here if you have any questions." Her words encouraged me to wander, and I did. The living room opened into a spacious kitchen with sleek countertops and stainless steel appliances. Large windows overlooked the backyard, where a modest but charming garden waited to be explored. My initial unease began to fade as I imagined myself living here, hosting dinners, relaxing in the cozy corners of this perfect space. But as I moved from room to room, small details began to nag at me. A faint, lingering odor, earthy and metallic, drifted through the air. The walls in the hallway bore faint scratches, like something sharp had brushed against them. In the guest bathroom, a mirror was cracked along one corner, the jagged lines distorting my reflection. These things happen in older houses, I muttered to myself, brushing off the discomfort. I wanted to love the house, but something about it resisted my attempts to feel at ease. As I continued through the house, the unsettling details became harder to ignore. In one of the bedrooms, a small photo album lay open on a desk. The photos inside were faded and yellowed with age, showing blurry images of people I didn't recognize. It struck me as strange that such a personal item had been left behind, especially if the house was being shown as move-in ready. The next room was worse. A child's shoe sat tucked under the edge of the bed, its once bright laces frayed and gray with dust. The wallpaper here seemed older than in the rest of the house, and faint symbols were etched into one corner near the ceiling, loops and lines that reminded me of something I couldn't place. The unease that had been simmering now bubbled to the surface. I moved quickly through the remaining rooms, finding more inexplicable signs of past activity. A set of keys hanging in a closet, a burnt-out candle in the fireplace, and scuff marks leading to a locked basement door. I decided I'd seen enough. Whatever charm the house had held at first was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. I returned to the front door, expecting to find the realtor waiting on the porch, but she was nowhere in sight. Odd, I thought, but maybe she had stepped outside for a call. Reaching for the door handle, I turned it, but it didn't budge. Frowning, I tried again, twisting harder. The door was locked. My first thought was that I had accidentally locked it earlier, though I didn't remember doing so. I checked my pockets for the keys she had handed me at the start of the tour, but came up empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the stillness of the house. "Is anyone here?" No answer. The silence, once serene, now felt suffocating. I tried the door again, rattling it in frustration, but it refused to open. My heart began to race as I called out again, louder this time, but the house swallowed my voice. That's when I heard it, a faint sound from deeper inside the house. At first, it was just a creak, like footsteps on old floorboards. Then came the soft hum of something dragging across the floor, followed by a quiet, muffled whisper. The noise was faint but deliberate, too distinct to ignore. Panic set in, and I turned toward the hallway, searching for another way out. The noise grew louder as I stood frozen in the hallway, my mind racing. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor, punctuated by faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, only to realize I'd left it in the car. I was alone in the house, cut off from the outside world. I forced myself to move, turning away from the hallway and heading toward the kitchen. If the front door was locked, maybe one of the back exits was still open. My steps echoed unnaturally loud in the empty house, and I tried to quiet them, but every creak of the floorboards felt like a scream in the oppressive silence. Reaching the back of the house, I tried the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. It wouldn't budge. My fingers fumbled with the lock, but no matter how much I jiggled or forced it, the door refused to open. I moved to the windows, one by one, only to find them all sealed shut. Panic clawed at my chest. The sounds from deeper inside the house grew closer now, footsteps, dragging, and the occasional groan of shifting furniture. It was no longer a distant noise, it was here with me. Desperation set in as I scrambled for another option, my eyes darting around the room. That's when I saw it. A back door leading to what appeared to be a small laundry area. The door was ajar, the faintest sliver of moonlight spilling through the gap. Hope surged through me as I moved toward it, but something in the back of my mind warned me to stay alert. It felt too convenient, like bait waiting for the trap to spring. I pushed the back door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The cool night air hit my face, a sharp contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside the house. I stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest, and turned back for a brief moment. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark except for one, an upstairs room where a faint light flickered on. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a silhouette in the window. It was motionless, standing perfectly still, its features obscured by the dim light. The figure seemed to be watching me, its head tilted slightly as though in curiosity. My legs moved before my mind could catch up, and I sprinted across the backyard toward the driveway. Reaching the front of the house, I scanned for the realtor's car. It was gone. The spot where it had been parked when I arrived was now empty, and the driveway looked untouched, as if no car had been there at all. My own car was still there, thankfully, and I wasted no time unlocking the door and climbing inside. The engine sputtered to life, and I peeled out of the driveway, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I glanced in the rearview mirror as the house faded into the distance. The upstairs light was still on, and the figure remained in the window, unmoving, as though watching me leave. The drive home was a blur of adrenaline and unanswered questions. My thoughts raced, each one more unsettling than the last. Who or what had been inside that house? Why had the realtor disappeared, and why was the front door locked without explanation? The figure in the window haunted me, its presence burned into my mind. Once home, I locked every door and window, checking them twice. Even in the safety of my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent hours replaying the events, searching for logical explanations. Maybe it was a prank, I told myself. Or perhaps the realtor was hiding something. Illegal activity, squatters, or even something worse. The next day I tried calling the realtor. The number went straight to voicemail, and my follow-up texts went unanswered. Feeling uneasy, I searched for her online. To my surprise, I couldn't find any trace of her name or agency. It was as if she'd never existed. The house next door had always been a quiet presence. Its owners, a middle-aged couple, were friendly but unremarkable. Quick nods and polite smiles exchanged across the driveway. Their lights would come on at predictable hours, their dog would bark occasionally, and their cars came and went with the rhythm of a normal life. But that rhythm had stopped weeks ago. At first, I hadn't noticed. It was subtle. No lights, no cars, no barking. The house seemed to have gone dark overnight. I assumed they were on vacation or visiting family. But as the days stretched into weeks, the stillness became impossible to ignore. The lawn began to look unkempt, weeds creeping along the edges. Their mailbox overflowed with flyers, and a faint layer of dust collected on the porch furniture. It wasn't just the absence of life that struck me. It was how the house itself seemed to retreat, its windows dark and impenetrable, as though it were trying to fade from existence. At night, the silence was heavier. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought, but something about the house's emptiness unsettled me. It felt like it was waiting for something, or someone. It started small. One evening, as I closed the blinds in my living room, I glanced toward the house and noticed a curtain that hadn't been moved in weeks now hung slightly ajar. It was a minor detail, but it stuck with me. I rationalized it as wind or the pull of gravity on old fabric, yet the thought lingered. The next night I was startled by a faint noise. At first I thought it was coming from my own house, a creak of floorboards or the groan of the heating system. But as I listened, I realized it was outside. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like the shuffle of footsteps on pavement. I turned off my television and stood still, straining to hear. The sound came from the direction of the empty house. Before I could decide whether to investigate, it stopped, leaving the night in heavy silence once more. A few nights later, I saw the light. It flickered briefly in an upstairs window before vanishing again, like someone had turned on a flashlight and then quickly covered it. My heart raced as I stared into the darkness. It couldn't have been a trick of the eye. I was sure of what I'd seen. The more I noticed, the harder it became to ignore. I started paying closer attention to the house, especially at night. Each evening, I'd sit near the window. The glow of my living room lights dimmed, so I could see clearly. The movements were subtle at first, a faint shadow crossing behind the curtains, the curtain itself shifting slightly, as though someone were peeking out. Once I thought I saw a face, a pale blur in the upstairs window, but when I blinked, it was gone. I felt a growing sense of unease, but curiosity outweighed fear. I told myself it was nothing. The couple had probably returned without my noticing and were just keeping to themselves. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Something about the movements felt wrong. They were too sporadic, too cautious, like whoever or whatever was inside didn't want to be seen. The breaking point came on a night when the noises grew louder. It started as the usual faint creaks, but then I heard something new. Muffled voices, barely audible through the still night air. It wasn't my imagination. The sound came from inside the house. I stood frozen by my window, staring into the dark outline of the house. The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by a low hum, like the vibration of distant machinery. My hands clenched into fists as I debated what to do. I could call the police, but what would I say? That I'd heard faint noises in an empty house? It wasn't enough. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The cool night air prickled against my skin as I approached the property. My heart pounded in my chest, each step heavier than the last. Standing in the driveway, I scanned the house with my flashlight. The beam illuminated the porch, the windows, and the overgrown lawn, but nothing moved. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The house responded with silence, its dark windows staring back at me like hollow eyes. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A light flickered on in an upstairs room, revealing a shadowy silhouette. My breath caught in my throat. The light flickered again, then vanished, plunging the house back into darkness. The silhouette in the upstairs window haunted me as I stood frozen in the driveway. My flashlight trembled in my grip, the narrow beam of light doing little to dispel the oppressive darkness surrounding the house. My mind raced with questions. Who was up there? Why had they been watching me? Taking a shaky breath, I stepped closer to the house. The air seemed colder here, and an unsettling stillness hung over the property, as though the house itself were holding its breath. My flashlight illuminated faint smudges on the windows, the glass streaked with grime and something darker, like oily fingerprints. The smell hit me next, faint but sharp, metallic and oddly familiar. It reminded me of rust or blood, though I tried to push the thought away. As I approached the front porch, I noticed scratches near the base of the door. They were jagged and uneven, as though someone had clawed at the wood in desperation. I hesitated at the porch steps, debating whether to knock or leave. Before I could decide, a soft thud echoed from inside the house, followed by the faint creak of footsteps overhead. My heart leapt, and I stumbled back, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The upstairs window where I had seen the silhouette remained dark, but I could feel eyes on me, heavy and unrelenting. The weight of the house's gaze became unbearable. I turned and hurried back to my yard, my steps quick and uneven as I fought the urge to run. The moment I crossed the invisible boundary between their property and mine, the tension in the air seemed to ease, but my paranoia didn't. From the safety of my porch, I looked back. The house stood in eerie silence, its windows dark and uninviting. I watched for any sign of movement, my flashlight clutched tightly in one hand. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, as I started to turn away, I saw it, a faint shadow moving behind the curtains of the upstairs window. The realization hit me like a punch. Someone, or something, was inside that house, and they knew I had been watching. I bolted for my door, locking it behind me and closing every curtain in the house. My breathing was ragged as I leaned against the wall. The image of the shadow burned into my mind. I tried to tell myself I was safe, but the unease lingered, a constant weight pressing down on my chest. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and heightened paranoia. I avoided the neighbor's house, going out of my way to keep my blinds drawn and my movements quiet. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At night, I would hear faint noises outside my own house, soft taps on the window, the rustle of leaves in the yard. Each time I would peer through the blinds, my heart racing, but I never saw anything. It felt as though the house next door had extended its reach, its presence creeping into my own home. Desperate for answers, I began asking the other neighbors about the house. Most of them were vague, brushing off my questions with casual indifference. One older man who lived a few doors down mentioned the couple had moved out weeks ago, but seemed hesitant to say more. "There's always been something strange about that place," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "The last few families didn't stay long, always moving out in a hurry. Best to leave it alone." His words did little to comfort me. That night, I scoured the internet for any mention of the house. Buried among property listings and tax records, I found old news articles about the area, stories of unexplained disappearances, and vague references to disturbances that neighbors couldn't explain. The house had a history, and it wasn't a good one. I wanted to move on, to let go of the house and the questions it left unanswered. But the memory of that night, the shadow in the window, the scratches on the door, and the faint metallic smell refused to fade. Even as the weeks passed and the house remained silent, the unease lingered. Shopping trips were part of my weekly rhythm, a mundane but necessary task I didn't think twice about. The local grocery store was a familiar space, its layout committed to memory. I could navigate the aisles without much thought, often grabbing the same items week after week. Routine brought comfort. That day was no different. I parked my car, grabbed a cart, and started down the produce aisle. The store was neither busy nor empty, just the usual hum of activity. A mother wrangling her kids near the cereal aisle, an older man squinting at a list, and the faint chatter of employees stocking shelves filled the air. I moved methodically through the store, tossing in vegetables, milk, bread, and a few indulgences, a pint of ice cream and a bag of chips. My list wasn't long, and I felt the familiar satisfaction of ticking off each item. At checkout, the cashier gave me a polite smile, scanning my items and making small talk I barely registered. It was all so ordinary, so forgettable. With my groceries bagged and paid for, I loaded them into my trunk and headed home, already thinking about the dinner I'd prepare. I didn't notice anything unusual. Not yet. Once home, I carried the bags inside, setting them on the kitchen counter. The familiar rhythm continued. Unpack, sort, and store. The vegetables went into the crisper, the milk in the fridge, and the bread into its designated spot on the counter. It wasn't until I reached the third bag that I paused. Inside was an item I didn't remember selecting, a small, hardcover notebook. It was plain, black, and unmarked, the kind of thing I might have used for journaling years ago, but hadn't touched in ages. "Huh," I muttered to myself, turning it over in my hands. I chalked it up to a mistake, maybe something another shopper had left behind. Setting it aside, I continued unpacking, but the notebook wasn't the only thing. In the same bag was a package of tea, my favorite brand, but one I hadn't bought in months. I frowned, certain I hadn't put it in my cart. It wasn't on my list, and I hadn't even walked past the tea aisle. My unease deepened when I pulled out a third item, a candle in a scent I used to love but hadn't mentioned to anyone in years. The combination of these items felt too specific to be random. I stopped unpacking, staring at the collection on my counter. Something was wrong. I examined the items closely, trying to make sense of their presence. The notebook's pages were blank, but its very existence felt invasive, as if someone had seen my past habits and decided to mirror them. The tea and candle were even worse, intimately personal, tied to routines and preferences I hadn't shared with anyone. A chill ran down my spine as I thought back to the store. I replayed the trip in my mind, walking the aisles, picking items from the shelves, interacting with the cashier. Nothing stood out, no moment when someone could have slipped these things into my cart. I checked the receipt, hoping for an answer. The notebook, tea, and candle weren't listed. It didn't make sense. How could items I hadn't paid for or chosen end up in my bags? The only explanation was that someone had placed them there deliberately. But who and why? The questions unsettled me. These weren't random mistakes or misplaced items. They felt targeted, purposeful. My hands shook as I gathered the objects, placing them back in the bag. I needed to step away, to think. Sitting at the kitchen table, I forced myself to go over the shopping trip again, step by step. I closed my eyes, visualizing the store's layout, the path I had taken, and the people I had encountered. Had anyone been too close to me in the aisles? I remembered a woman passing me near the dairy section, and a man in the checkout line behind me, but nothing about them seemed unusual at the time. No one had approached me or lingered near my cart. My memory faltered when I tried to recall the checkout process. I could see the cashier scanning my items and the vague blur of conversation, but it felt incomplete, like trying to recall a dream. Had I been distracted? Was there a moment when someone could have slipped these things into my cart unnoticed? The more I thought about it, the less certain I became. My mind began conjuring scenarios: an employee sneaking items into the bagging area, another shopper reaching into my cart when I wasn't looking. But none of it felt plausible. The trip had been so ordinary, uneventful to the point of being forgettable. Except now, it wasn't forgettable at all. It was unsettling, intrusive, and impossible to explain. The next day, the unease lingered like a weight on my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about the items, how they had gotten into my bags, and how disturbingly personal they were. Every time I glanced at the notebook, the tea, or the candle, I felt a prickle of discomfort, as though the objects were watching me. I began to notice other things. At first, they were small. A drawer in the kitchen left slightly ajar when I was sure I had closed it, a notification on my phone about a failed login attempt from an unfamiliar location, or the faint sound of a car idling outside my house late at night. These details might have been meaningless, but after the shopping incident, every oddity felt like a piece of a larger, unseen puzzle. I checked my front door twice before bed, ensuring it was locked. I even moved the items to the back of a closet, out of sight. But they stayed in my thoughts, an intrusive presence that refused to be ignored. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every passing car, sent my imagination spiraling. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that whoever had placed those items in my bags wasn't finished. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I returned to the store the next day. I approached the customer service desk, clutching my receipt, and explained what had happened. The employee, a young man with an air of indifference, listened with a blank expression. "Are you sure you didn't pick them up by mistake?" he asked, glancing at the receipt. "I'm sure," I said firmly. "They're not even listed on the receipt. I didn't pay for them." He shrugged. "Sometimes people leave stuff behind in their carts. Maybe you picked up a cart someone else was using." I thought back to the trip. No, I had taken my cart straight from the entrance. I was certain it hadn't been swapped. "What about the security cameras?" I asked. "Can you check if anyone tampered with my cart or bags?" The employee sighed and disappeared into the back room, promising to check. Minutes ticked by as I waited, my anxiety mounting. When he finally returned, he offered a sheepish shrug. "Sorry, but the cameras near the checkout weren't working yesterday. Maintenance is looking into it." It felt like a dead end, but the vagueness of his answer only made me more suspicious. Was it a coincidence that the cameras weren't working? Or was someone covering their tracks? Frustrated and no closer to answers, I went home and tried to piece everything together. I sat at my desk, replaying the trip in my mind again, but now my focus shifted to the days leading up to it. Had there been other signs I'd missed? Moments when I felt observed or out of sync with my usual routine? The more I thought about it, the more unsettling details emerged. A strange email from a retailer I'd never shopped at, suggesting items that matched my recent searches. A man who had parked next to me at the grocery store, lingering in his car long after I'd gone inside. Even an old journal I had tossed out weeks ago, suddenly reappearing in a drawer I hadn't opened in months. It wasn't just the items in my shopping bags. It was everything. Someone had been studying me, my habits, my preferences, the small details I thought were private. The items weren't random. They were a message. Someone wanted me to know they'd been watching, and they wanted me to feel exposed. The thought made my skin crawl. I closed the blinds and double-checked the locks again,